Today we're going to be talking about The Advice Trap by Michael Bungay Stanier. So this book it's kind of a companion book to another book called The Coaching Habit, which is one of the clearest books on how to lead and coach people like in a non-sport setting. So typically when you think of coaching, I think society in general thinks of it in terms of sports. So obviously, Britain, you can relate to that as far as coaching. But what I love about what Michael has done in not just these two books, The Coaching Habit and The Advice Trap, but in his work, like his organization, he has like a training and coaching organization. What I love that he's done is being able to show how coaching can work even in a work environment. So it's just interesting that we have this concept of having coaches in sports with elite athletes. Why wouldn't we also have coaching in a work environment? But what's interesting about it is it's just like, well, how do you translate coaching in a work environment? And I think that's the great work that Michael has done, is he's taken this concept of coaching and translated it into a simple way to how do you coach in a work environment or within a family or others. So The Coaching Habit teaches one core skill. So I kind of see these books. I mean, we titled this episode The Advice Trap. That's the book we're focused on. But really, it's The Advice Trap and The Coaching Habit are kind of a companion set. And really, it teaches one core skill, which is to stay curious longer and slow down your reflex to jump in with answers. So The Advice Trap explains why these questions are hard to use in real life. And he basically calls, what I love about it, he calls it the advice monster, which is kind of this impulse to jump in with solutions before you even understand what's going on. So this book is about noticing that impulse and holding it back long enough for better thinking to happen. It's not saying like anti-advice, you never give advice to people, but it just shows why giving advice as your default creates more problems than it actually solves. So today we'll just walk through a few of the core big ideas and paradigms from the Advice Trap. We're going to play 3 great clips from Michael. And this first one that I'm going to share is all around what the advice monster looks like, why we all have one, and how taming it changes how you work, lead, and, even if you're a parent, how you can parent. So let's jump into this first clip from Michael.
I mean, you recognize it. Everybody probably recognizes it. It's like when somebody starts talking and within about 5 seconds, probably faster for many of us, this thing inside looms up out of the darkness and says, oh, I know what they need to know. Okay, I just need them to stop talking now because I've already got the thing in my head, the idea, the opinion, the point of view, the stance, the suggestion that they need to hear. And there's many, many occasions when advice is exactly the thing that's appropriate. But most of us rush to advice giving just way too fast. And my quest, if you had to boil it down to a single behavior change, is can you stay curious a little bit longer? Can you rush to action and advice giving a little bit more slowly? And it's your advice monster that makes it difficult because, and there are 3 kind of aspects to it. Tell it, save it, and control it. You can either think of these as 3 different advice monsters or just 3 different kind of characteristics of the same advice monster, whatever works best for you.
And sorry, Michael, to interrupt, but I think in the book you describe it as you used to have like a costume closet or box in Australia growing up. And it was like the advice monster is changing. I could totally relate to that because we had a similar thing growing up where my mom had this kind of costume closet room.
Yeah.
And so it's a great analogy to imagine just the monster. And he's like, oh, okay, I need to be in the control it phase. Let me just change real quick. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. I could totally relate to it because I had a similar closet growing up. So I have got 2 kind of ways that I can totally remember the analogy. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, but you were saying there's kind of the 3 ways it manifests.
Yeah, 3 ways it manifests, or 3 costumes it puts on, or 3 different monsters all wearing different costumes, whatever you want. Tell it, save it, and control it. So tell it has convinced you that the way you add value is to have all the answers all the answers all the time, all the answers all the time to all the things. And actually, if you don't have those answers, then you're letting yourself down and you're letting everybody around you down. So people feel that pressure often, in all sorts of different aspects. It's like, I'm a parent. I should know everything. I've just been promoted to be a manager. I should know everything. And, it's impossible. It's a terrible burden to bear to think that you have to know everything, but you can feel that drive. Save it is its own indifferent burden, which is like your job is to protect everybody and everything from everything all the time. Don't let anybody stumble or struggle or find it difficult or not know what to do. Your job is to jump in and rescue them from the discomfort every time. And then the third one is control it. It's the sneakiest of the three, which is like your job is to make sure you got your hands on the wheel all the time. Don't let anybody else lean in, but it's like keeping control from the start through the middle to the end, because that's the only way you're going to fight back chaos, is to make sure that you're in control. And there are short-term reasons why all of those are beneficial to you. There's a benefit to you being seen as the smart person who has all the answers. There's a benefit to you being the superhero who saves everybody and who's the rescuer. There's this benefit to you being in control the whole time. But as well as prizes, there are punishments. And part of what I'm trying to do in the Advice Trap book is to have people understand the cost to them and to those around them in those short-term behaviors, because that's what the advice monster is. It's, if there's one thing I can do well-ish is to kind of thingify, like, abstract concepts and try and turn them into a metaphor that kind of resonates. And honestly, these three advice monsters, they're kind of short-term ego states where you're like, I want to be the smart person. I want to be the person in control. I want to be the person who's the savior. And all of these feed a certain short-term need we have, but there are consequences. And the advice, ironically, of course, that I'm trying to offer up, or at least the perspective I'm trying to share, is to say, you know what, it'd be interesting if you could just stay curious a little bit longer, tame that advice monster, and see what happens.
So the first thing I'll say is this idea and this concept of the advice monster has ever since I first heard it, it's actually helped me in life when you kind of get that inkling of just wanting to jump in and you're like, oh, wait, you got that monster in the back of your head. So it's a great way to remember. But Michael in that clip talks about the three versions of the monster. The tell it wants to have all the answers, save it wants to rescue people, and then control it wants to stay in charge. So Britton, I'm curious, when you first heard these three, which one kind of landed for you, and, where have you seen that show up most, whether football or life?
Yeah. Honestly, all three. What's really cool about it is I think all three are very distinct. I experience all three times. I think in an earlier episode, I was talking about the save it complex that I have with my son and how I feel like inhibit his growth sometimes because I feel that complex. Or I know it's the classic girls and guys, the difference between girls and guys that every guy has to learn in marriage is stop trying to solve your wife's problem. She's not asking you to solve her problems. She's asking you to listen. I definitely have had to learn that. But I really love this concept. I think I've thought of two things with this. Is the first is that there is an advice monster that creeps up in you before a conversation even happens. I think it's just when you are living life and you view something. And I think I'm reminded of it for those who have seen Ted Lasso, the show Ted Lasso. There's a great clip from it where Ted Lasso talks about how he was doubted his whole life by people. But people were judgmental and they weren't curious, and he talks about how you need to be curious and not judgmental. And I think that's the first part. So before you even get in a conversation with someone and you see something and you have that advice monster creep up or that judgment monster where you're like, why do they do this? Why are they like this? It's learning to tame that and refrain from judgment and be curious, truly, why do they do this? Why are they like this? Why does this person get bad grades? Why does this person act this way towards a coach? Rather than judging, you being curious, okay, there is a reason why. What am I not understanding? And then once you get into the conversation, what I love about Michael is he doesn't just say stop giving advice. He explains kind of why our advice isn't as good as we think. And that's kind of what he goes into in this next part. Our grandfather used to say it was, what was it, diagnose before you prescribe? Isn't that what he would say?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, he talks about how the first problem that someone brings to you rarely is the real problem. It's rarely the root of the problem, and why our brains convince us that our advice is to give right then to that initial problem, when really our advice isn't that perfect. So this next clip kind of gets into that, about how slowing down actually helps people think for themselves and get to the real problem. So we'll listen to this next clip.
I think there are three reasons why advice giving is overrated, or three different ways advice giving is not the most useful course to follow. And the first two you've covered. The first is this. Typically, the first challenge somebody comes to you with isn't actually the real challenge. It's their best guess, it's their start, it's a symptom. So if you're trying to solve the first thing that shows up, often you're trying to solve the wrong thing. It might be really straightforward. It's like somebody says, "Hey, where's the coffee?" That's probably unambiguous. And you don't have to say, "How do you feel about coffee?" You can just say, "The coffee's over there on the corner." But anything more kind of complex around, humans and systems and the world we live in, often the first challenge isn't the real challenge. Even if it is. Like, let's say that you've really figured out that this is the thing that needs to be solved. The second thing you need to realize is you have all these cognitive biases in your brain that are very keen to convince you that your advice is amazing all the time. But your advice just is not as good as you think it is. It's outdated, it's biased, it's tainted, it's influenced by the primacy effect and the recency effect, and there's probably 1,000 different cognitive biases and effects that it's influenced by. It is worthwhile to be skeptical about how good your advice actually is. And in fact, what I would offer to people is, if you can build a reputation for being the person who figures out what the real problem is, rather than being the person who comes up with fast ideas, you will be a much more valued person, because advice is everywhere. Solutions are everywhere. Honestly, all the stuff that you do know, I can actually Google faster than you can tell me about it. And I can come up with a more succinct explanation of whatever it is than you've got. So, even the stuff you've got right, it's not the best version of it. But even if, for the sake of argument, let's say you've got the challenge and you're really clear on what the challenge actually is, and actually you've got a stonkingly good idea. It's gold dust. It's pearls of wisdom. It's amazing. The question you've then got to ask yourself is the most useful thing for me to do here to share that idea? And that's not a rhetorical question. That's a real question. It's because there are times where the answer is yes, it is. The thing to do is share your idea. It's just not the answer every time. And most people think it is. But if your goal is actually to help the other person, not just solve the problem, but to grow and increase their capacity and their confidence and their sense of self-sufficiency and their sense of autonomy and their sense of agency, then it just might be worthwhile hanging on a bit. Look, you may have a great opportunity to share this in a minute or 3 minutes or 10 minutes. Just wait a bit. And maybe you'll go, right, I think we know what the real challenge is. Tell me, what are your first thoughts on how to go about solving this? What do you reckon? What's your best idea? What else could you do? Great, and what else could you do? And you know what? They might have a better idea than you. Or they might have, and this is important, an idea that's not better than yours, but it's good enough. And then you got this interesting question, which is what's more worthwhile here? To allow them to own the problem, own the solution, feel that agency, have that success, even if their idea is 10% not as good as yours. Maybe that's the bigger win. And maybe they have nothing but terrible ideas, in which case you go, great, I love how you're thinking, but let me share what I think might be a really good idea for you here. And then you get to share your gold-plated piece of, marvel, and you can take it from there.
Yeah, I love that. The first part of that clip, he starts out by saying that, the first thing that someone says oftentimes isn't the real issue. And whether that's, because they are scared to share the real issue or because they don't even know what the real issue is, I don't think it matters as much. I love that he said, if you can kind of build the reputation of being someone who helps find out what that real issue is rather than someone who just comes in to solve the problems, I feel like, one, you'll get a lot of people opening up to you, talking to you about things more. But two, I think you just help people grow so much more. He says our advice isn't necessarily as good as we think because of all the biases and just our experience. Obviously, it makes sense in our mind because of our experience, but might not make sense in another. And ChatGPT can give you just as many, 10 times more pieces of advice that are better. So what people really need is space to think. And when you slow down and ask a couple questions, I remember this was about a month ago. I had a friend of mine who's been interviewing for medical school, and he's having a hard time kind of really inserting himself in the midst of all these people who are competing for the same position. And he said to me, he said, I feel like you're really good at talking to people higher up. How would you go through this interview process? And so in a way, I felt like he was like giving me permission to give advice. But then after I gave advice, I remember thinking, gosh, that makes so much more sense. Being me, the advice that I gave with all my human experience and kind of what I tend to do, it makes sense. But really, I don't know if it was the most sound advice for someone that's not me. And I really feel like I could have done a better job of just exploring, like, what do you think? What do you mean? What are some of your strengths with this? And anyways, that was just a learning experience for me. And another thing that comes to mind is in parenting. I'll never forget a conversation I had with my wife about this. About a year into our son's life, because I obviously would be at football for most of the day, and then I'd come home and I would want to help out, putting him to bed, feeding him and things. And it always was kind of in an unconventional way because I wasn't around during the day. And so I remember my son, Nelson is his name, he would scream and cry, and there would be all these growing pains and stuff. And here I am trying to help, and I'm kind of making the situation worse in a way. And so my wife would just be so frustrated, like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So she'd just take him because she's like, at least I know I can do it in a way where he won't cry or something. And I remember just feeling so like sad about that, like I wasn't helping. And finally I had a conversation with her. I was like, look, I know you know the right way to do it, but I need to find that myself. And so she started to kind of give me space to find my way of doing it. And it did have some growing pains, right? Pangs, but eventually I found a way that was different than her way, but it was my way. And I think her giving me that space to be a parent rather than just always coming in with, no, you got to do it like this, or this is giving me that space to learn. I became 10 times more confident as a parent, more competent. My relationship with my son got better, and I was able to help out more. So I think that's just a good kind of example of something like this where, you may think you have the solution, but someone might come up with a solution that's more attuned to them, and it still works.
No, that's a great example, Britt. I think what you said is spot on. Most of the time, people don't need our direct answer. They need a little space to think out loud. And when you give them that space, most of the time you can land on something more accurate. So again, what I like about how Michael frames all of this is, again, he's not saying that advice is bad or you shouldn't give advice. He's just saying, tame that monster, the advice monster that just wants to jump in and solve problems and solutions. So it really is about just taking a step back and kind of having this space. And also, I think seeing people, it's almost like you're seeing people and their potential. And like you said, Britt, like who they are as a person. And a lot of times they just may need to talk it through with someone to understand like themselves, which I think is great. So the last clip we're going to share from Michael, which I think is one of the more profound clips that I've heard. Michael goes in and explains why listening and kind of like we've talked about having this space is so uncomfortable for most of us. And it really ties directly to something our grandfather taught in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, habit 5, which is seek first to understand, then to be understood. Which sounds very simple. It's like, oh yeah, do that. It's very simple. But anyone who has tried it and tried to live it knows how hard that actually is. And what I love about this last clip we're going to show is Michael gets at what I think is the core reason, which is basically that listening means giving up control. And it means giving up the comfort of being the one with all the answers. So it's about sitting in this kind of uncertainty long enough to actually understand what's going on. And I think the natural human tendency, most of us don't like that. So we'll end with this clip from Michael, which again, I think is profound. And again, appreciate everyone listening. We're going to do, after this episode, we're going to do a brief follow-up kind of a one principle episode next week, getting into just a little bit more of this as well. So stay tuned for that. But we appreciate everyone listening, and we'll see y'all soon.
We've all been taught all our lives that the way you add value and the way you prove your worth is to have the answer. So there's a deep habit that most of us are kind of wrestling with. There's that. And the reason below that is, you know what? I feel I get my ego stroked by being the person who's, answering rather than listening to understand. I've got the answer. I'm saving the day. I'm in control. So we've got some kind of ego drivers that are part of it. But I think if you go another level down, there's a way that the act of listening, seeking to understand, is an act of empowerment. And there aren't many people who will go, well, I'm against empowerment. But here's the cost of empowerment. It actually is giving up some of your power to that other person. And when you're seeking to understand, you're in a place that's less comfortable. It's a bit ambiguous. It's a bit uncertain. It's a bit humble. It's a bit out of the spotlight. You're not sure what you're going to find out. You might discover that you don't understand. You might discover that you're not smart enough, or you're talking to somebody who's a bit of a nutcase or whatever. There's less comfort and certainty. So even though giving advice or even listening so that you can give advice, often that is not the useful tactic, because actually we don't need you to talk. We don't need your advice. It is a more comfortable place to be, even though it's wrong. So I think at its heart, there's just this deep sense of this is what it means to give up power. And for many of us, particularly those of us who have, privilege, the language of the moment, and I'm one of those people, straight, white, tall, very good-looking man, blah, blah, blah. Again, there's the humor. It's like I have a lot of that privilege and power. And how do I think about trading that off and giving that up?